Welcome to State of Mind, being human and living well.
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 I'm Deborah Sloss, producer, host, and licensed marriage and family therapist. My pronouns are she, her. Today, we're unpacking two often confused relationship dynamics, codependence and interdependence. While interdependence fosters mutual support with both people contributing to and benefiting from their relationship, codependence tends to involve one person giving excessively while trying to meet their own needs through controlling or managing the other person. For some, these patterns show up repeatedly across relationships. For others, they're isolated to one particularly challenging connection, often involving a loved one with mental health challenges, substance use issues, or their own unhealthy relational behaviors. Navigating these dynamics can leave us feeling stuck, frustrated, and unsure where to draw the line between helping and enabling. This episode is for anyone who has wrestled with maintaining boundaries, accepting what's beyond their control, and fostering healthier relationships, especially in caregiving roles such as parenting or supporting a partner or loved one. If this resonates, stay with us as we explore practical ways to move from codependency towards interdependence. Joining us for this discussion about codependency versus interdependence and the choices we can make in relationships are our guests, Jill and Catherine Zwick, who goes by Kat. Jill, a member of Codependence Anonymous, or CODA, will be using her first name only to honor the group's tradition of anonymity. Let me introduce you to our guests. Jill is a retired public health nurse who's dedicated her life to cultivating healthier relationships with herself and others. Through therapy, spiritual exploration, and more than 20 years in CODA, she's worked through struggles with control, perfectionism, and unhealthy boundaries. Jill has also navigated the challenges of supporting two family members with mental health issues, finding ways to maintain safe and respectful connections despite ongoing difficulties. Today, she faces her own health challenges with gratitude and a grounded perspective. Kat Zwick uses they, them, and she, her pronouns and is a licensed professional clinical counselor and the founder and executive director of Ride the Wave Recovery. Their practice focuses on supporting individuals of all genders, sexualities, and neurotypes as they recover from eating disorders, addictions, codependency, and trauma. A certified DBT therapist, Kat has been helping clients address codependency since 2009 and draws on their own recovery journey to inspire and guide others. Welcome to State of Mind, Jill and Kat. Thank you both for being here today to share your insights and your experiences on this important and complex topic.
Thanks, Deborah.
Thank you.
Let's get started then, Kat. I'd like to begin with you. You had a very specific and comprehensive definition of codependency. Can you share with us what that is?
For sure. Yeah, so I guess I just want to first say that codependency isn't in the statistic manual, right? And so it's not a mental disorder. And so that's part of why I think it is so hard to define and why there are so many definitions. So I'm just choosing the one that I really like, which is defined by Pia Mellody, who is considered, a leader in the treatment of codependency, addictions, eating disorders, and trauma. And she says that there are 5 core symptoms of codependence. So I'm going to share those here. Difficulty with self-esteem and self-love, difficulty setting functional boundaries with other people and protecting oneself, difficulty owning one's own reality and defining who one is, difficulty addressing one's adult needs and wants, manifesting into self-care, and difficulty being moderate or contained. So I just want to add to this to the 5 core symptoms, and this is sort of embedded in that clients often ask me for kind of a single sentence about, well, what is codependency? Like, how do I recognize it in myself? How do I know if I'm codependent? So what I often say is that codependency is at root compulsively putting the thoughts, feelings, desires, needs, and realities of other people above your own, or being highly reactive to the thoughts, feelings, desires, needs, and realities of other people, because your sense of those things feels really fragile and threatened. And so some people find that they vacillate back and forth between those two expressions of codependency, whereas others are sort of fixed at one end.
And, in the intro, I was making mention that some people don't like that term because they think of it as a label. I was trying to get at that it being more of a description of a pattern that you might find yourself in, sometimes in only one relationship. And I'm wondering if you want to say more about that.
Absolutely. I think that it can be used as a label to describe a whole style of being. And that tends to be the case, I think, when people maybe grew up in a more dysfunctional family, and that has created a way of being in the world, right? And that maybe that person does need to kind of globally recover, right? To find a sense of who they are, because they weren't nurtured to have a sense of who they are. But with other folks, that wasn't the case. And so it's that they have found themselves in a particular situation where they don't know how to handle, oh my gosh, I don't know how to respond to, someone's mental health struggle or physical condition or addiction. This is totally outside of my comfort zone or my expertise or just my knowledge base. And I find myself reacting to this in a way that's not good for me or them. Right. And so it's not necessarily pervasive. Right. It's just based on, not having the skill, not having the cultural surround to know what to do.
I certainly have seen people who find themselves in a long-term relationship like that sometimes start to feel shaped by it over time.
Yeah, absolutely. That can happen. And I think that that's also supported, unfortunately, culturally, right? Again, we don't have, I don't think anyway, a lot of understanding culturally in the West, in the, I'll just say the colonized West, to know what to do in these situations. And so we're just doing our best. And sometimes what starts out as doing our best becomes a pattern that's not really serving anyone particularly well.
I'm wondering if you want to share anything about why you came to have such a special interest in this area and how you developed this specialty in your work.
Sure. So codependency, that word was actually in my life from a really young age, but it was very mystical. I didn't really understand what it meant. My mother was in recovery. She got into a 12-step program for addiction when I was quite young. I was actually 8 or 9, and she was in and out of her own recovery. But I came to learn in my 20s and early 30s that I was codependent in a way that I hadn't really understood. And so I really did come to learn that I suffered with all of those core symptoms that I had mentioned above, all 5 of those. And in fact, some of the symptoms that I did actually think were positive and noble, like putting other people's needs and crises and realities before my own well-being. I actually thought those were positive things. And I found that this led to a tremendous amount of suffering for myself, and it actually pushed people away that I was actually trying to love. So I sought out trying to change and recover because I really wanted to have healthy relationships and be a healthy person. And so it's interesting that my recovery journey probably started, it was once I was in graduate school to be a therapist. And I'm so glad that I started to learn how to be a healthier person before I actually became a practitioner, because I think it can also get us into trouble as therapists if we're overly codependent.
Well, our other guest today, Jill, has been involved with Codependence Anonymous, for over 20 years. She says it saved her life. Jill, welcome. And can you share with us some of what happened in your life leading up to getting involved in CODA that was so problematic for you?
Yes, and I really liked what Kat had to say with her definition, because codependency, a lot of people think of it as it's only when you're in a relationship with somebody else. And actually, you can have a lot of the unmanageability of codependency just being by yourself. That's my experience. I think of codependency as an identity disorder of extremes. So they're like human behaviors that are taken to extreme emotion, extreme feelings, extreme thoughts that lead to unmanageability. So it led to me, in my case, of always feeling either less than or more than. And I really think it happened in infancy and early childhood, because it's such a compulsion And I don't think it's something that happened to me when I was older. My parents were really good people. They weren't particularly the best parental material, and I don't fault them for that. But I think it really led to me having issues in my relationships. And as a child, I was like the third child of a Midwestern family. And by the time I came along, I was kind of the bonus child. And it seemed like if they were into parenting before I was born, by the time I came along, it's like, whatever, the other kids did okay. And I was sort of invisible is the way I feel about the way I was brought up. And I didn't feel that I had any intrinsic value. And this is all just feeling. This is not, truth. It's just what my feeling is. And in order to feel that I belonged, which I never did, I never felt like I belonged. I felt like I had to work extra hard and do the extra and be perfect and be a stellar human being, but I didn't even know what that was. So that was kind of how things started. And it really wasn't obvious to me. I dealt with issues. I always had this anxiety, which I recognize now. I didn't recognize it then. And it wasn't until many years later when I was married and then ended up divorcing that I started recognizing this is bad. I don't want to go through this again. And I can see that this pattern is in this relationship, but I could see this happening in another relationship. So when it was pretty clear that my marriage it was a 22-year marriage, so it was a long-term thing. When I saw that it was starting to come apart, I was really desperate to find something to help me not repeat that pattern again.
What were some of the features of the patterns that were problematic in that relationship?
Well, the primary issue that I exhibited in my codependency was control issues. So in my relationship with my ex-spouse, I played the role more of a parent, and he played the role more of a child. And that's a very simplistic explanation. It wasn't that cut and dry. But I was the one that would try and keep everything together and do the responsible behaviors. And he went along with things. And it was interesting. My identity was wrapped up in being a wife and mother, even though I did work. And his identity was more about the things that he wanted to do. He was a musician and he really enjoyed doing that and spent a lot of time doing that. But when it really became difficult was after we had a child, because after our son was born, it was starting to be obvious to me that I kind of had two children in the household. At least that was my feeling. I'm not saying that he was that way, but that was my feeling. And it was my son and my husband to some extent. And so I felt like if I didn't hold everything together, the world was going to fall apart. So there were a lot of controlling behaviors, and it wasn't good for me because it was very stressful, and it wasn't good for him either because it probably stifled his maturity somewhat, And after my son got older, the extremes in our relationship issues became more and more difficult. I became more and more controlling, and he became more and more distant. And the last 10 years of the relationship were not good, and we went to a lot of counseling. And interestingly, the counselors told us that we were very codependent, and we went to one after the other, and they'd say that, and I'd say, okay, what do we do about this? And most of them offered nothing. One of them said, just knowing helps. And I said, no, it doesn't. You're the third one that's told me that. So I need tools to move on from this situation. And I didn't get them until after my ex and I separated, and I found an ad for Codependence Anonymous. It was back in the days of Prince. It was a classified ad. And I went to a meeting, and there were only two other people there. And it opened up a whole new portal in my life that I'm grateful for.
So one of the things that, Jill, you said that really stood out to me was also your experience in your childhood of that you didn't feel you had intrinsic value. And so, the reason I want to highlight that too is that not only do I think that's common in codependency, but also it makes so much sense, and I have so much compassion for it, because it's like you develop codependent traits trying to find that love and approval that we know you deserved, right? You were this precious child. You needed love and attention, and you were just trying to figure out how to get it because you weren't getting it, right? And you didn't know how to get that feeling that we all need. And so I think that's a very, very common refrain that I end up finding out when I work with clients is, gosh, I'm realizing I did not feel that I had inherent worth, right? I just didn't feel I had it. And so whether it was perfectionism, straight A's, or even being a rebel, right? So there's a lot of ways it ends up coming out, but we come back to that root of, I just didn't feel I had worth. And so I developed these traits. And so I appreciated that. And the other piece that really stood out in your share was control, right? At root, I think codependent behaviors, no matter what they are, even with people who feel they are not being controlling in the slightest, right? We come down to, I am trying to control other people and or my experience because I'm finding something intolerable. I think sometimes it's hard to get to, though, if people aren't yet aware that they're codependent. I have a lot of people who, and I was like this myself, I'm like, I'm not controlling. I'm the most accepting, loving person that I know. I have not a controlling bone in my body. That's what I used to think, certainly before I realized I was codependent, right? But then I realized like I was helping people, right, in order to get them to change. And I just didn't realize that. This is before I was a therapist, when people were not paying me, right? So I appreciated the emphasis, Jill, on control. And I think also people not recognizing the role confusion and, the emphasis on, oh, I was being his parent, and not realizing that. And I think for a lot of codependents, thinking that's normal in peer relationships to be like a parent or a therapist, when you're actually supposed to be someone's friend or someone's, spouse, and thinking it's love, right? Thinking like that's a role confusion. I find that very, very common in codependency, to just not know the difference. Yeah. So just a lot I thought was really helpful and relatable.
I'm thinking too about, the sort of hero's role of sort of like saving the day too, that's a really common one, that you're going to be the one who can make the difference or get this person straight or help them out of this terrible situation. And just, that seduction that people feel frequently about needing to feel important and valuable in that way.
It's true. And I think it's interesting because I think what I have found at times when people have sort of if they have the codependency piece, because there can be other reasons people have the hero need that aren't always rooted in codependency. But when I find it with codependency, what I find at root, and I'm curious, Jill, if you've had this experience, because it sounds like you had the savior piece in you, and I know this is true for me too, is that when I look underneath it, it's like, I didn't think that I had any other function or that I deserved to be any other thing. Like, it's almost like and I find this with clients too. It's like, yeah, I'm not supposed to be anything else. I'm supposed to exist to help and rescue others. And if I turn my attention to anything else, it doesn't compute. So it's, it's sort of the codependence, again, there's that lack of self, right? It's sort of this, like, there is nothing else. What do you, like, why would I do anything else? Right. So I don't know if, Jill, you had that experience of, I'm supposed to be helping my childlike spouse. I'm supposed to be doing everything for him.
Well, yeah, I would like to speak to that. One was that looking back on it, especially now that we're having this conversation, I'm realizing how much I channeled what I learned from my mother. My dad was somebody that was kind of childlike, and he was very interested in his own stuff. He was not at all interested in the family. And my mom was picking up all those loose ends, and she was making sure that our physical needs were met, and she was trying to keep everything together. And I don't think she was conscious of it, and I don't think I was conscious of it either when I was married.
You've been listening to State of Mind, Being Human and Living Well. I'm your host, Deborah Sloss. Today we're unpacking the differences between codependency and interdependence in relationships and exploring ways to foster healthier dynamics, even in the most challenging situations. Joining me for this conversation are Jill, a longtime member of Codependence Anonymous, and Kat Zwick, a psychotherapist and recovery specialist. Back to our interview.
One of the things in Codependence Anonymous that we talk about is that it's a spiritual dilemma. And for me, it definitely was. And I kept feeling like something was wrong, but I couldn't figure out what it was. And after we went to counseling, my husband did say, well, you're micromanaging my behavior. And as a perfect controlling codependent, I would say, well, if you would do what you need to do, I wouldn't have to take care of everything else. But the other thing was that after I had made a lot of recovery in my controlling behaviors, to my surprise, after I unpeeled that layer, I discovered that what was really causing a lot of this stuff and led to my controlling behaviors was my low self-esteem. I just didn't feel that I had worth. So I was always treading water, just trying to make everything external okay, because within myself, I didn't feel like I was okay. Now, the good news is that I don't feel that way anymore. But it's also interesting. Let me stop there and talk about my ex-husband again. We have a relationship now that works. The relationship we had before didn't work. And he's married to somebody else now. I'm married to somebody else now. And even when things were really bad, and they did get pretty bad, we thought that each of us deserved to be happy. And I wanted to do it within the context of the marriage because I came from a family where there were about 3 divorces per capita. And when I got married, to me, it was a spiritual event, and I never wanted to be divorced. But in the end, I discovered it takes 2 people to make a relationship work, but it only takes 1 person to sabotage it. And I was trying to do the heavy lifting for both sides of the relationship, and it didn't work. It just simply didn't work. It wasn't that I was right or wrong. It just didn't work.
I think that's another really big piece of codependency that I talk about with clients a lot is what percentage of the relationship are you doing? Because often in codependency, even if you're not with someone who has a mental health condition or is infantile or whatever it is, I often find with codependency, tremendous overfunctioning in relationships. They're doing 80%. They're doing 100%. They'll come in and they'll have already recited both sides of a potential conversation, right? And it's like, whoa, whoa, whoa. What about just starting with, I was having this thought or I was having this desire. Bring that to your partner and then see what happens. Right. So how do we help people scale back to just 50%? So I think that's a really good point, Jill, about codependency is you don't have to do both sides of the relationship. You only have to do your side. And then you see what happens.
This makes me want to come back and ask you, Jill, if you could describe, how did the 12-step work you did in CODA start to help you live better? Specifically, what changes did you see yourself start to make through the support and help you got from that program?
Well, the first thing that came out when I went to a meeting was that the first meeting, there were only 2 people. And when they talked about the characteristics of codependency and the patterns, I realized that even though therapists would say you're codependent, none of them told me what those characteristics were. And when they mentioned those things and they told their story, I realized I felt like they'd been following me around with a notepad. And the biggest thing that stood out was I'm not the only one. And I'm not crazy. In the end, my ex had convinced me that I was a mean and awful person that nobody could ever live with. I was absolutely convinced of that. And I didn't even know who I was. To make it even more significant, because he was a musician, most of our friends were his friends. And when we split up, my entire social life disappeared. I was also involved with a yoga group where that was a big part of our social circle. And I think the discomfort of having us split up, even though I continued to go and he didn't, people just kind of walked away from me. I literally had to start from ground zero. But having had the support of other people that had been through this made it much more doable. I don't think without the support of peers, I could have done it by myself.
This seems like a good moment to turn to you, Kat. And I'm wondering if you can just speak to sort of the distinction between codependent and interdependent relationship patterns and sort of paint a picture for people to know where those two poles are so we can get a sense of what exists in between.
Absolutely. So I just literally took this off a website. I liked it. I can't speak to the therapy center. So it's from Gender and Sexuality Therapy Center. So I know nothing about the therapy center. I just like their list of interdependent relationship traits, right? So this is like being interdependent and sort of what it might look like, right? So the ability to actively listen to your partner, establishing healthy boundaries and respecting the healthy boundaries of your partner, time for your own interests, clear and direct communication, taking personal responsibility for your behaviors and your emotions. I'm going to go ahead and flag that one as huge. Creating safety for another person to be vulnerable, engaging and responding to one another, using open and approachable body language, not being afraid to say no, and not keeping parts of yourself hidden in order to please your partner. So that is what I would say in general is a pretty nice list of if you feel that you can do those things in your relationship and you're offering those things in your relationship. It's a pretty good list of a healthy, interdependent way of being. That doesn't mean, to your point, Deborah, we're all these evolved, enlightened, constantly interdependent beings. I don't know personally if that's possible. I think I have a thought later that when I was writing notes for this, and I'm like, I always hold hope for myself, but I don't know. I don't know if it's possible. And to your point, I think all of us probably slip into codependent or dysfunctional or, just being human. We're human. We are human, fallible beings. And of course, if I'm in a long-term relationship with someone, friends included, I am going to set aside my needs at times, right? And I'm going to be available for a crisis and a struggle and the, illness of my partner, or, that's just a naturally occurring reality of choosing to be in community with other people.
I think you're pointing to a really important point. I just want to put sort of emphasis on it's not always the behaviors that define it, because sometimes we might do the same behavior, but if it comes from a different place and a different set of thoughts and a different set of feelings, it can have a very different meaning. So like we might step in to help a friend in a time of crisis, but if we're not doing it from a desperate place to like make ourselves okay, that's a very different kind of, the drive behind it is very different, and therefore it doesn't necessarily represent codependence.
So in my definition of codependency, I consider it a process addiction, and I'm not saying other people have to think that, but I conceptualize it as self-erasing and self-effacing, just like any other addiction. Me personally, I'm not saying anybody else has to think that, but controlling other people's and being focused outward on other people is essentially a way of getting rid of myself compulsively, and it's not based in choice, groundedness, self-esteem, who I am. So just what you said, Deborah, the same is true of alcohol, right? People might take a drink and not have any problem with alcohol whatsoever, but an alcoholic takes a drink and that motivation is different. It's for all sorts of different reasons. The same is true of helping out your spouse, right? If it's coming from a place of self-sacrifice, self-annihilation, I don't want to feel my feelings, I want to control someone else, I want to be a savior because I don't have any sense of self-worth, and I'm going to be resentful about it later and hold it against you that I did something nice for you, right? Then that does need to be questioned, or interrogated, potentially helped, right? So my goal in helping clients in terms of moving to interdependence and away from codependence is to help people understand your motivation for your behavior and build your self-esteem and your sense of identity and your own innate wisdom your innate intuition, yourself, right? The nature of who you are, so that you're making choices from your conscious mind and not from essentially fear, which I was hearing Jill speak to. So that that's conscious. So we're living in conscious community with each other, not compulsive community.
I think this is a really good moment to sort of put a point on it, in that when I first approached you about the show, the original concept we had was this idea about exploring what it's like to be in relationships when we can't make decisions for other people, and we're sort of tormented by that. And both of you came back to me and said, that's the wrong question. What we really need, or that's the wrong statement. What we really need to be talking about is the choices we can make. So I think you've just made a very good example of what it is that we're trying to get at, is like, how do you find that place where you are able to make choices, and which ones are the ones you can make?
Yeah.
I thought this would be a good time to talk about the road from codependent to interdependent relationship patterns. And I'm thinking about, when it comes to these difficult and problematic codependent relationship patterns, Kat, what do you see as some of the core aspects or steps to recovery?
Sure. So I'm going to use some examples, two examples of where there is, problematic codependent person in a relationship in a difficult situation, and the person choosing, a more interdependent way forward, to help highlight both, actually, right? What it looks like to be stuck in a codependent place and then moving into a more interdependent place. Because we also haven't talked a ton yet about when there's actually some mental health challenges in the picture, because that does introduce some complexity. So in the first example, say you have a child who is 13 years old, who's engaging in a pretty serious eating disorder. The parent may not have been aware of this at first, but now, he's come aware of this. So parents, codependent or not, may initially struggle to know what to do, because they may be shocked, scared, they may experience grief, right? That's all actually very normative, whether there's codependency or not for the parent. However, when someone is struggling with codependency, he may jump in, try to control the child in an over-functioning way that is not appropriate to the parent's role. So that means he would try to be the doctor, he would try to be the therapist, he would try to be the dietitian, he would try to fix the child. He may also take it personally that the child is struggling with an eating disorder and feel hurt and upset about what is happening for the child, seeming to almost absorb the child's possible feelings underlying the eating disorder, even if the child is not expressing those feelings themselves. So in this type of presentation of codependency, this is only one, by the way, expression of it, the parent may really overshadow the child. And in this case, the parent is holding the reins really tightly, because their reality, self-esteem, identity, and boundaries are really bound up in the experience of the child, right? It's almost like there's not much separation between the child's experience and the parent's experience. So this parent in this example is finding it very hard to tolerate the difficult feelings that are arising in the parent in response to what the child is experiencing. So this parent wants to fix things immediately and becomes a bunch of different providers and people rather than staying in a parent role. So this parent, I'm just going to give as an example, I've made this person up. This is not a real person, but say this parent called me, all right, as an eating disorder professional to try to get some help. One of the things I'm going to do is try to help this parent, not only with their eating disorder child, but I am going to start helping this parent reorient his approach to his child. And I'm going to try to give him some guidance about his enmeshed response to his child and ask him to engage in some backing off behaviors and explain why. So in guiding him hopefully towards his own codependency recovery, and that may involve asking him to seek out his own therapy. It may involve suggesting going to Coda. I may say, I'd love for you to read Facing Codependence, this book by Pia Melody, because I'm seeing this overshadowing, overfunctioning response to his child's very legitimate and serious eating disorder. So this goes back, Deborah, to what you and I had talked about a little bit ago. I don't actually know in that moment, and it's not my job because he's hiring me to take care of his kid in that moment. I don't know if it's specific just to this relationship, if something's gotten super activated, he's scared, he's really scared for his kid, or if this is something much bigger that is based in his own childhood. He may have a more pervasive codependent style, right? But I would be trying to guide him towards backing off, let the providers help your child. You need to be more functioning as a supporter, a listener, a hugger, right? And see if you can learn how to tolerate some of this intense anxiety that's coming up in response to what's happening for your kid. But creating distance essentially between who you are as a person and who your child is as a person.
I want to turn to you, Jill, about sharing some of your own recovery path. And what would you say has been most central to your recovery, from codependent relationship patterns to more interdependent patterns?
I think the continued participation in Codependence Anonymous meetings and working the 12 steps. Going to meetings is a good start, but it's not going to achieve the desired result for most people. Having been in it long enough, I've seen that the people that follow the steps and do the framework have amazing recovery strides. And people that just come to the meetings off and on, or just come to the meetings and don't do the step work, they don't have as much recovery. I found that it makes all my relationships work better. And the healthiest thing I could have ever done for my son was to get into codependency recovery.
How do you think that's changed your relationship? Like, what would you say the key points of change have been?
I would say that I let him make his own decisions within reasonable boundaries. By the way, relating to Kat's vignette, he actually did develop an eating disorder when his dad and I were getting divorced. His dad basically ignored it. I was able to make a decision to get in touch with his doctor, who handled it very well, and then put him in touch with a registered dietitian who also handled it really well and basically solved the problem for me. I didn't have to do it myself. Before I got into recovery, I'm not convinced I would have done that. The big thing that I've gotten from Codependence Anonymous and doing step work is perspective on life. I basically don't think I had perspective that was realistic before I got into recovery. And I can't explain how it works, but it has been kind of magical to me that I've been able to do better in relationships and actually enjoy life. And it's been quite an adventure. But, I wish I could say, oh, it works like this and this. But the main thing I think it does is give perspective. And also, I have found that one of the great things about codependency recovery is that before I got into recovery, I felt that some part of me felt I was the center of the universe. And if I didn't keep the universe together, it was going to fly apart. And in codependency recovery, I discovered that the universe kind of functions on its own, and I'm part of it. And that's a huge difference in how I perceive life.
I'm Deborah Sloss, your host, and you're listening to State of Mind, Being Human and Living Well. Today, we're unpacking the complex and often misunderstood topic of codependency versus interdependence in relationships. We're exploring how to cultivate greater autonomy and well-being, even in the most challenging dynamics. Joining me for this conversation are Jill, a member of Codependence Anonymous, or CODA, and Kat Zwick, a psychotherapist and recovery specialist. Every State of Mind episode has a resource list, and any we talk about today are included in the show notes for this episode. We've also added closed captions, too. So go to www.stateofmindmedia.org to find all that. Now, let's get back to our interview. This makes me think about a point Kat and you and I talked about briefly before you came on the show, which was that delicate balance between developing skills to be in relationships, more healthy relationships, and sometimes that the best choice is not to be in relationship. And I'm wondering if you want to say more about that.
That's a hard one. And I think that, I'll just preface this by saying it's so individual, and I'm nobody's therapist who's not my actual client. So this is just general. um, but, I think it does come back to something that Jill just said about, you know, what feels right and thinking about your intuition. But there are some relationships that I think, ultimately it may be in again, your identity, your self-esteem, your boundary, in your best interest to walk away from a relationship. And I think sometimes within codependency, and this is certainly true of me in my history, thinking that loyalty and self-sacrifice is nobler than my well-being, right? And that's very common in codependency. And it's these things are also very hard to tease apart when we're community oriented, or when we come from a culture that's family centric, that isn't individualistic. And it's very, very challenging to piece all of that out and piece that apart, because I am white and I do come from a more individualistic background, but just my personal ethics, I'm much more community oriented, right? So I'm much more about the we and the collective and collaboration as a value. And so I will take longer, and I will consider all the pieces and all the parties involved and these pieces. And that's true for a lot of people that I treat who are much more community minded, and activists and people of color and marginalized and minoritized people who come from cultures that are just more community oriented. So all that's just to say that it's individual choice and culturally contextual. And if you're being harmed, right? If you're being taken advantage of, these things still need to be taken into consideration, and so I think those are the times when I do think leaning on your trusted advisors or your trusted mentors to help you discern, like, what is my gut instinct? What is codependency? Like, what are community values? How do I hold these things in balance? How do I continue to honor my sovereignty, my rights in the midst of this situation? Because again, there's nobility and there's ethics and there's community, but there's also your human rights.
And what are the boundaries I can set and will be respected?
Right. And the misconception I run into constantly when I say to a client, right, or a parent that I think you may have some codependent traits is there's no addiction in my family. There's no addicts in my life. That's the common misconception, is that codependency is only related to addiction and loving an addict or an alcoholic. And so I usually explain, yes, sort of the original popular understanding is that it had to do with alcoholism and being a loved one to an alcoholic, but now it really it's not about that, right? It's more about how we relate to other people versus how we relate to ourselves. And then I explain. But it really does keep people away from the term to think it's only related to alcoholism and addiction.
While we're talking to you, I'm wondering if someone out there was listening and wondering if they may be locked into a problematic codependent pattern in a relationship, what would you want them to know, and what would be a very first step they could take toward healthier relationship patterns?
Yeah, I think, the soundbite I would want to communicate is you absolutely can recover from the suffering that you're engaged in right now. You do have choices. You did not cause the other person's problems, and you cannot cure the other person's problems. Turn the attention towards yourself, your own suffering, and find some help today to reduce your suffering. So thinking more clearly and wisely in yourself will always be a gift to your loved ones. That's what I would say.
Thank you. Jill, what would you suggest as a first step if someone was thinking that they might be locked into some unhealthy relationship patterns?
I would say, first of all, slow down. And is what I'm doing giving meaningful help?
Beautiful. So I always like, in almost all my shows, I like to sort of explore what these two areas of sort of common misconceptions about the topic we're discussing, or ways in which stigma really impacts that topic or impacts people's ability to access, help or support. So I'm going to give you the option to choose either one of those. Just say which one you're choosing. And I wonder, Jill, would you want to speak to one of those things, either misconceptions or
Yes, I can talk about that. The misconception is that codependency is something that always involves a relationship between two people. And I feel that my codependent characteristics, I can have difficulty within my own head. It doesn't have to necessarily involve another person.
This is the point in the show where I like to ask people if there's specific resources they might like to name. And I want listeners to know that we'll have a lot more resources than you have time to talk about today on our resource list that's posted with the show. But this would be a good point if you have one or two that you maybe just really want to highlight that would be good for listeners to know about. Jill, do you want to start?
Yes. One of them that's really easy to get to is codependence.org. And it is the main website for Codependence Anonymous. It is free to join meetings. They have a list of meetings, but they also have a list of printed resources if you think you might be codependent, but you're not sure and you want to explore it more. There are some links to articles. There's one person who's pretty well known in the codependency community who's a writer who I really like what she has to say, and her name is Melody Beattie. That's Beattie. You can Google her name and things will come up. She comes from a tradition where she initially had addiction. So for people that have that as an issue, it might be really helpful. The other thing is for anybody that's dealing with mental illness or personality disorder in a very difficult relationship, I stumbled on this website called Out of the Fog. And it's FOG stands for fear, obligation, and guilt. And I find that they have things to do and things not to do, which are very simple and straightforward that can be very helpful in situations.
I also just want to mention we'll have NAMI too, National Alliance on Mental Illness, listed on the resource list. Kat, are there a couple resources you'd like to highlight off the list?
Yeah, I think I already mentioned Facing Codependence, which is like kind of my go-to book. It's an easy read. That's by Pia Melody. And she does have this truly amazing companion workbook called Breaking Free. There's a lot of workbooks out there. I have to say this is one of the most comprehensive change yourself workbooks I've ever seen. I actually am working through it myself because I think it's just truly incredible. So she has that. And then the other thing is, I do run a DBT mindfulness group series, and I'm actually not saying this to plug myself, but I guess technically it is a self-plug, but I offer it specifically to help with codependency, which I don't know if a lot of people advertise DBT for that reason, because what I find is that people can engage in reactive behaviors because they're codependent. And so I utilize DBT to help people recovering from codependency, and I specifically advertise for that. So I just thought I would mention it to specifically the Santa Cruz community.
Thank you. Jill, is there any closing thoughts you want to leave listeners with?
Yes, I think of codependency as the illusion of having power over that which you are powerless. It's an illusory vision of what's going on. I noticed in my codependency tendencies, there is an intellectual component and an emotional component. And my intellectual component was that I should be anti-dependent. I was raised that way by my mom, who was raised that way by her mom, who was raised that way by her mom. I knew all three of them. And they all said to me, you can't ever depend on a man. So I externalized that I generalized it to you can't depend on anybody. Now, emotionally, it was just the opposite. I had no intrinsic self-esteem, so I was trying to get my esteem elsewhere. And to give you an example of how extreme it was, there was a school bus driver that would chat with me in a way my parents never did and would give me his undivided attention. And oh my God, I was just absolutely in love with that relationship. And here was somebody that would talk to me about my garden and give me undivided attention. So I was seeking that approval elsewhere. But intellectually, I knew I couldn't depend on anybody. So it was a really big disconnect.
Thank you. What about you, Kat? Anything that you'd like to leave listeners with?
I think if listeners feel that they struggle with codependency, I think one of the things that, I would suggest is start engaging in just a daily practice of being with yourself in some way. Just be with yourself. Quiet time, meditating, go for a quiet walk, journal, do a tarot reading, right? That can be very popular in Santa Cruz. Make gratitude lists, but just, people with codependency have a really hard time just being with themselves. And so start to create a daily habit of being with yourself with no distraction and just see what starts to happen. No planning. quiet time with yourself and see what emerges. And, if that feels really painful, maybe write about it or seek out some of these resources we're talking about. But I really think dedicating some time to just being with yourself is super important as a step to healing.
On the topic of learning how to be in more healthy relationship with ourselves and with others, we heard from this listener. Here's Hannah.
My name is Hannah. I was first suggested to check out Al-Anon by my hairstylist. She thought it might be a good fit. I was 19 at the time and had grown up surrounded by alcoholics and addicts. It was my view that my family were the ones with the problem, and if only they stopped drinking and maybe listened to my suggestions, then everything would be fine. I was enmeshed in everyone's life to the point of losing my own, but I was in complete denial. Through Al-Anon, I found out I held on to the alcoholics just as tightly as the alcoholics held on to their bottles. In that first Al-Anon meeting, I heard a complete stranger tell my story. Our names and details might have been different, but she knew what it was like to live with alcoholics. My family took up all of my headspace. I woke up thinking of ways to manage their lives and went to bed thinking, if only they would listen to me, then everything would be all right. And mind you, I was well far away, out of the house, at college, still obsessing. At that first meeting, I learned I wasn't alone and that alcoholism is a family disease that affects the whole family, including me. I learned I didn't cause it, I can't control it, and I can't cure it. What a relief. I set down the burden of fixing my family that night and have never looked back. In attending Al-Anon meetings regularly and practicing the program, my life has changed. First and foremost, my relationship with myself has gotten so much better. I've discovered who I am as a person, and it's really beautiful. My relationships with my family and my romantic partners have also improved. I've learned that I can love without losing myself and that I am worthy of love myself. At 7 years in Al-Anon, my brother died from an overdose in the home we grew up in. The universe had brought me to our family home just days before, and Al-Anon had healed my wounds, so I was able to be a loving sister to him. Within 2 months after my brother's death, my mother died from cirrhosis of the liver. Before her death, Al-Anon taught me grace, and I was able to make amends with her before she passed away. The program and the people of Al-Anon carried me through the darkest of this grief and helped me see that even this too shall pass. Life continues to happen even when we do everything right. Al-Anon has taught me whether the alcoholic is still drinking or not, I can find contentment and even happiness. I have become my own person and no longer wake up and ask other people how my day is going to go. I have joy, love, and a lot of hope in my life thanks to my hairstylist suggesting I give this thing called Al-Anon a try. I hope if you're having a similar situation that you might find the same hope that I've found in Al-Anon.
Thank you, Hannah. You've been listening to State of Mind, being human and living well.
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 I want to say a huge thank you to our guests today, Jill and Catherine Zwick, and thanks to you for joining us. To learn more, check out the wealth of information included on the resource list in the show notes for this episode. If you found today's show interesting, you may also want to check out episode 52 on healing from dysfunctional families with the ACA 12-step program, and episode 67, healing from childhood sexual abuse. New episodes of State of Mind exploring mental health and wellness are released the first Sunday of every month and can be found along with our complete archive on our website at www.stateofmindmedia.org. If you missed part of this episode or you just want to hear it again, subscribe to our podcast on all the major podcast platforms. Also, when you rate and review our podcast, you do help it get found and heard by more listeners. So if you like this or any of our episodes, could you please do that for us? Special thanks to Yusuf Hassanain and VJ Luca for audio production, Patrice Vecchione for In Your Voice story coaching, Sarah Altman for community outreach, and Katrina Tattenham for advanced research. And thanks to acoustic guitarist Adrian Legg for composing, performing, and donating the use of our theme music. State of Mind was developed and originally broadcast in association with KSQD-FM in Santa Cruz, California. We always want to hear from listeners and community members just like you. You can submit your very own In Your Voice recording and become part of the conversation by either calling in to leave a message or recording an audio file right on your phone. Either way, tell us about a mental health experience you've had, something that's contributed to your mental health recovery, or share a resource that's been helpful for you. We really do want to hear from you, and your voice may just be on one of our future shows. Submission details can be found at www.stateofmindmedia.org. Come on back and join us again next month for a whole new episode of State of Mind. Until then, live well.